What is up, guys? It is Matthew Maz Fishing, and we are back again for another video. This is going to be episode 2 of our How to Float Fish series, in which we are going to dive into basically how to rig up when you're going fishing for steelhead. So if you guys haven't seen episode 1, we basically dive into the rod and reel setup, as well as some line selection and stuff like that. So I highly suggest you guys check it out. Having the right rod and reel and the right line is very important. So if you haven't seen it, go take a look. First things first, as we said in our last video, we have our 10 or 12 pound main line. So the next thing we have to look at is really what type of float we want to use. So there's a couple of different types of floats, and I'm going to break it down and explain to you guys what float is good for what purpose, and really try to make it as simple as possible for you to understand. So the first thing we're gonna dive into is our float selection. When you begin looking at floats, there's a couple of different styles of floats. So to start, there is your stem style of float. As you can see, there's a little stem that comes up here, as well as on the bottom. There's that long stem there that actually comes right out. So that's one of the main styles you'll tend to find. The next main style you'll tend to see is what's called a slip float. So here's an example of one here. This one's made by Cool Water. The previous one I showed, that stem style of float, was Raven. And you can see there's actually a hole right down the middle of the float, that little piece right there that goes right through to the bottom. So there's a couple of differences between the two. When you're using, say, a stem style float, you use something called float tubing. So float tubing are essentially little pieces of silicone, as you can see there, and they actually slide onto those little stems that I was showing you guys. So there's one on the bottom and one on the top. In the case of Raven, the bottom is actually a smaller diameter. I believe it's like 3/32 of an inch, and the top I think is 1/16. I could be wrong, but if you go on the Raven website, I'm sure you guys can figure it out on there. So they have some that's called like the tip top tubing. That's for the top of the float. That is the larger diameter, and if you look at the bottom, that is the smaller diameter. So now I'm gonna show you guys how you would actually set up a stem style of float, and then how you would set up a slip style float. So to begin, we're gonna slide our tubing onto our line. So the orange tubing, which I have in my hand there, you can't really see, is the larger diameter tubing. That's gonna go on first, since that is for the top of the float. So we're gonna slide our line right through that. There you have it. Next, we are going to put the smaller diameter tubing onto the line. Slip that through. And this is on our main line, which should be anywhere from roughly 8 to about 12 or even 15 pounds. So there you have it. That's our setup so far. We have our 2 pieces of tubing, nothing else. So once you have your tubing on the line, you can actually go and put your float on. So you're gonna grab it, just as I showed you earlier. Doesn't matter what order you do this. You could do the top or the bottom first. I'm gonna slide our tubing on there. And a little tip for you guys, I like to leave it overhanging. As you can see, the stem ends, and then there's a little bit of extra tubing. Keeps your line from getting wrapped up and tangled. I'm gonna do the same thing on the top. Slide that tubing on, pull the line tight, and there you have it. Now your float is secured to your line. So the nice thing about these floats is you can very quickly and efficiently change out your style of float if you were fishing, say, faster and deeper water versus shallow and slow moving water, or vice versa. You can very easily, without cutting off any of your extra pieces, which you will learn about later, you can pull that tubing off. And so that, for example, was a fast medium style float. As you can see on the text there, it says FM, and this is a 5 gram float, which for me, for where I fish, that's kind of a staple. I'll talk about the grams a little bit later. Then I can move it to, say, this style of float, more of like an acorn style, which is meant for your fast and shallow water. And just like that, my line is now using that float. The other thing that's nice and simple about this style of float with your stems on it, if If you want to go deeper, slide one piece of your float off, slide it right up your line, and there you go. The line under our float is now significantly longer for deeper water. So now we're gonna move on and dive into our slip style of float. So this one in particular is a cool water float. It's a 4-gram acorn style float, which, as you saw from the Raven floats, that's for a more fast and shallow water. If you guys do go on the Raven site, a nice thing that they really do is they break it down. As I was saying, the actual font on the float will tell you what that's actually meant for, what style of water it's meant for fishing. So if you go on the Raven website, they kind of help you, and it's a good guide really for beginners. That's the way I kind of learned to figure out what floats are good for what style of fishing. Anyways, without further ado, this is how we use our slip style float. So the first thing you're gonna have to pick up is something called a float peg. They're also used in bass fishing sometimes to peg, say, a tungsten weight, and they look like that. So you'll see there's these metal strands. There's a little kind of egg-shaped piece on there, a little rubber piece. And so first we're gonna put a couple of these guys on our line. So in order to do this, grab the end of our line, just right there. You grab this guy, and you'll see at the end, there's a little hole. I don't know if you can see that too well. But anyways, we're gonna slide our line through that hole, grab the tag end, and now you can see I have the line. We're gonna simply slide that little rubber piece onto our line. So it's now on there. You're gonna slide it all the way down until you're past that tag end. And now you'll see I have that little black piece on my line. So personally, I like to use at least 2 of these guys because these are what holds your float in place. Sometimes they can slip a little bit on your line, so I'm gonna slip a second one on there. Now it doesn't matter what color these are or anything like that. The specific float stops I have here come in a bunch of different colors. There's like a yellow, red, and a black. I don't think there's any different purpose or anything. They're just different colors. There you go. So now we have 2 of those little guys. There's a black one and a yellow one. Hope you guys can see that. The next thing we're gonna do is we are going to grab our float. I showed you that hole earlier, and we're gonna put our line right through it. So now you can see the float is on the line. Those 2 little stops are going to keep it from sliding up any further. Now we are going to secure it in place using another one of those pegs. So you don't really need to put 2 on the bottom because there's no force in that direction. There's nothing that's gonna actually push your float any further down. Now you can see my float is now pegged in place. So that's how you attach your slip style of float to your line. Now there are other styles of floats they make. These are the most common styles and what I personally use. So now that we have our float on our line, we're now going to have to determine how much weight we need to actually caulk the float. So essentially what that means is if you look on most floats, you can see on the cool water ones, they have those little silver lines, and we have where the orange actually starts. So the way floats are designed, they're meant to actually be sitting sag down in the water, and on these floats you want them to go up to that little orange mark. In comparison, if you look at the Raven floats, they have the black paint that goes up to that little white stripe on it, and then up to the orange. Same idea, we want it to be up to that orange piece. So if you were to put the float in the water right now, this would all be sitting above water. Your float would probably be tipped over. So what we're gonna do is grab some split shots and apply those to the line underneath the float. So this is when the actual grams of the float start to come into play. So the specific one we have on right now says, I don't think you're gonna be able to read that at all, but it says number 4. So this is a 4-gram float. In comparison, this is a bigger style of float that I would use on, say, the Niagara Whirlpool. It is a 24-gram float. So the smaller the waterway you're fishing, and say the slower the water is moving, you can decrease the grams of your float. So essentially what that means is the float will get smaller and it takes less weight to pull that float underwater. Again, just to simplify that, if you're fishing Slower moving water, that tends to be more shallow, lower gram of float. If you are fishing faster water that's deeper, higher grams. So where I typically fish, anywhere from about a 3 to about a 6 gram float will do the job no problem. It depends sometimes on wind and the holes I tend on fishing that day. For the most part, as a good benchmark, I tend to sit with a 5 gram float. So guys, I originally intended on including a lot more in this video and touching up on a lot more aspects of how to actually rig. But after further reviewing all the footage and stuff that I got, it looks like I'm definitely gonna need to post a few more videos so I can really go into the detail and the depth that I want and make it as easy as possible for you guys to understand to float fish. So I hope you guys really enjoyed this video. Make sure you stay tuned for the following ones. We're gonna dive all the way down into even like advanced rigs, how I tie tandem rigs, how I tie like a bead and bag combo, etc. You guys won't wanna miss it if you're learning to float fish. It's really gonna help you. Thank you guys so much. Have a great day and peace.